You're listening to The Other 50%, a herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Walker. This is the podcast where I talk to successful women in entertainment and hear their stories. For this episode, number 199, I got to meet Katica Roy. Katica is a gender economist and the CEO and founder of Denver-based Pipeline, an award-winning software-as-a-service company that leverages artificial intelligence to identify and drive economic gains through gender parity. Pipeline launched the first gender equity app on Salesforce's AppExchange. The Pipeline platform was named one of Time Magazine's best inventions of 2019 and Fast Company's 2020 World's Most Innovative Companies. In 2017, Katica was named a Luminary by Colorado Technology. In 2018, a Colorado Governor's Fellow, and in 2019, a Top 25 Most Powerful Women in Business and a Stevie Entrepreneur of the Year Gold Award. She is also an industry entrepreneur, thought leader, and frequent editorial contributor and speaker. Katica's articles have been published by World Economic Forum, NBC, Fast Company, Forbes, Bloomberg, Huffington Post, Entrepreneur, The Hill, The Advocate, Salesforce, and Morning Consult. In 2019, her articles garnered over 1 billion impressions. If you know me at all, you know how I love talking to someone who is an expert in all things equity. Get ready to dig in. You can find us at theother50%.com for added features, photos, show notes, and the merchandise. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts and all the podcast places. Okay, here's my conversation with Katica Roy. Have a listen. What do you do?
I am the founder and CEO of Pipeline, which is a software company that increases the financial performance of companies through closing the gender equity gap.
You are speaking my language. Tell us all about it. How does it work? Let's start there. And then I want to hear how you even had the idea to do it. But what is it really?
So what Pipeline is we actually started with research. So there's a lot of really great macroeconomic research about the economic impact of gender equity. We were interested more in the microeconomic case. What does that look like within a company? So we started with research. We did a research study across 4,000 companies in 29 countries. And what we found was that for every 10% increase in gender equity toward parity, toward 50-50, and we measure that across some KPIs, there's a 1 to 2% increase in revenue.
There's the data, people.
So gender equity is not only a social issue, it's actually a massive economic opportunity. So then what we did, and we collected over 1 billion data points, we then took that and developed our platform. So what the software actually does is it's augmented decision-making. So similar to Google Maps or Waze to get from point A to point B, we do the very same thing for companies' people decisions. So we are a recommendations engine. They essentially take an action in their HR systems. That sends a trigger to the Pipeline platform that they may need a recommendation. We review that decision, and then if they need one, we send them a recommendation back. Those people decisions actually fall into 5 categories. So hiring, internal hiring, mobility, pay, performance, potential, and promotion.
Okay, so just talk it through really granularly. How does that work? Say I have a position open and I want to, do you start with who do I interview? Do you start there?
What we do, so just to give you an example, to walk you through a use case, and I think this is particularly interesting. So one of the things that we have found through our implementations is that you can't close the gender pay gap by starting with pay. And the reason is that pay is the symptom, it's not the disease. So in other words, pay is the quantitative value that you place on your talent. But the actual value you place on your talent in corporations happens before that in performance and potential. So most companies do at least annual performance reviews, something like that. So
I'm doing them right now.
Yeah, most people don't like
it. Good times.
So you write a performance review, you save it as a draft. That sends a trigger to the Pipeline platform that you need a recommendation. So we take in that data. We use natural language processing to read through the performance reviews, call out bias phrases, and then we actually calibrate the ratings themselves, which means that we ensure that the ratings that you're giving your employees are equitable.
Hold on. So it reads Okay, I just want to dig into that. It would read a phrase, like if it says, is too emotional at meetings, like something like that?
Yes.
Okay, then what would it recommend you take it out or you say it in a different way?
That you edit it and say it in a different way.
So interesting. What other phrases might it pick up?
Aggressive. You've been aggressive lately. That's one. Often things to do with, what are some of the other ones that?
Child care.
Child care. There's that. There's a lot of, so one of the things we found sort of in aggregate is that women get a lot more commentary on their emotional state and men get just straight task commentary, like you did this well, that's it. So it could be like you've been emotional lately, you were aggressive, you took over that meeting and weren't aware of how other people felt, like those kinds of
those things that only women get penalized for, but behaviors that everybody exhibits.
Yeah.
So would it match, say, the word aggressive with this is a female review and alert it, or would it also grab it if it was on a male's review?
It's contextual. So it's not just the word, but it's the word in context. Like what are the words that are around it so that we understand the context with which aggressive is being used or emotional is being used. Those are trigger words anyway, but we would, it's within the context that it matters that word is actually used. And we've done some blind studies of our performance review data. And with a very high degree of accuracy, we can identify if that review was written about a woman or a man, even if we don't know. Like we know, but even if we don't know.
Because of how we talk to men versus women. So interesting. Okay. I'm debating between, do we go through the rest of the things that it captures? Or I have another question, which is, do you also have a lot of training in the organization around it so that they can put this language in context so that the people know, oh yeah, I get that feedback. I understand what it means and what the implications are and let me change my behavior. Or are they like, why would someone correct my word in this thing?
Yeah. So typically we focus on customer success. So if you think about the platform, we wrap around what we really focus on is adoption of that platform. We measure adoption through accepting the recommendations, and you accept recommendations, you improve your metrics, you move toward parity. That's kind of the logic of it. But we support their internal teams in communications and change management. So we are not out front on doing that. We're sort of behind the scenes. What's interesting about that is because the pipeline platform is automated, it's automatic, and it's data-driven. Just take pay as an example. One of our early taglines was unconscious bias meet conscious action. So if you're a manager, the one place that we actually touch net new employees is if you're hiring a new employee and you're moving them to an offer stage, we will give you a recommendation for pay for that, like a range for that person. If you are choosing as a manager to pay above the range that we gave you, now you're actually choosing to kick off a whole number of equity recommendations. So what it's actually doing is training the managers in how they make their decisions and being conscious of how they make their decisions so that they are changing the way their decisions to make them actually more equitable. Does that make sense?
It does. So if you're paying this new employee more, which great, good for you, but then you're creating a bunch of inequity to the people who are already hired, who already have salary bases.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's 2 of the pieces of the 5. Tell us about the other ones.
So potential is most companies use like a 9-box, which is a 3x3. And what we do is ensure that we actually give you a projected 9-box based on all of the data we have of where people sit in those 9 boxes. Performance happens in a couple ways. It really depends on the company. It's either an inline promotion. So you're a director, we're now going to make you a senior director, or it's a backfill promotion. A VP leaves and we can promote you into VP. What we essentially do is comb through a lot of data to tell you who's promotion ready, like who's ready for those positions. Hiring happens whenever you post a job requisition, we will show you, provided that they have the skills, a slate of internal candidates that can fill that position. And why that matters is that the best way to attract diverse talent is to ensure that your existing diverse talent is successful, and not just in their current role, but across your company. And so when someone posts a job requisition, on average, for 86% of all of those job requisitions, we find 5 or more qualified internal candidates that can fill those roles.
So it's one thing to have diversity within your organization. It's an entirely separate thing to make sure that those people are moving up in the ranks so that then they're represented in higher and higher levels.
Which is exactly. And that's the issue that is tough to tackle and is one of the main issues that we see in the workplace. I mean, just look at the number of female CEOs in the Fortune 500, the number of Black CEOs, of which all are men. There's 4 in the Fortune 500. That's the issue, is that issue of opportunity. One of the things that we've found, just to give you an example of that, is that very first promotion. So going from individual contributor to a frontline manager, that not only on average are men promoted at a rate of 21% greater than women, they actually receive 2 direct reports for every 1 direct report a woman receives.
Oh, isn't that interesting? I also wonder, I've noticed anecdotally, women may have to take a bunch of classes and a bunch of training to get that same promotion.
Right. And so so what we do is show it to you. Like that, it's
like, are you sure?
Yeah. So that, and it's really based on the idea of understanding how people's brains work. So my first master's degree is a combination of computer science and cognitive science. So understanding actually how you get people's behavior to change. And what we know is that it's harder to choose when you're actually showing people an equitable decision, it's harder for them to choose not to do it than if the status quo is to choose to be inequitable. I'm just not aware of it. So now you're actually fundamentally changing the way that it's a behavioral economics. You're fundamentally changing the way they're making decisions by virtue of changing the way that they're making decisions, also making managers' lives easier because there's a lot of people stuff that most managers don't like. You actually then are moving people toward equity. You know, one of the things that we've found, and I'll go through some of the others, but through our implementations is that, so for the average Fortune 500 company, they have 60,000 employees. And there are 3 key decisions that they make across their talent each year, which is performance, potential, and pay. So the average Fortune 500 company has 180,000 opportunities to move toward gender equity each and every year. That's what we make possible. And you take that together as a collective, and now you can actually ignite massive change.
So when companies say we are going to be committed to diversity and we are going to talk about it, we're all going to decide this is a great thing to do because we understand that we will make more money and we'll be better humans. You're providing the tool that they can actually do it and have the metrics. And more than measuring what they do, you're providing them with the tools to make the better decisions.
Correct.
Is it more than gender? Is it also racial and socioeconomic and all that diversity?
It's intersectional. It's gender first, not gender only, and then race and ethnicity as a subset of gender, as well as age. Oh, and then LGBTQ will be coming. That's the one sweetener, only because of the SCOTUS case that happened last week.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
And then you said if someone is looking for a candidate, you can present here the people who are promotion ready or have the skills to do it. How do you collect that data? How do you know?
So when we actually implement a pipeline in a company, we do a lot of data connecting, data scraping. There's a lot of essentially setting up of the platform itself. And part of that is to understand what skills does each person have. So we know what that is so that when you're looking for new talent, we've essentially know, for instance, Julie has these skills, Katica has these skills, and we can present them.
So who is your ideal client?
So our ideal customer are companies who have made a public commitment to gender equity, typically through a public pledge. And they've done some work on it, typically a pay equity study, or they've done something that's kind of really rolling up their sleeves. And they have over 10,000 employees. And what they discover is that there's a difference between making a commitment or making a pledge and living a pledge. And we enable them to live that pledge.
And it also seems like you take out we all have to do a lot of group therapy and feel terrible about how we've done things so far because it's just data.
Right. And also to understand unconscious bias, and we talk to people about this in their comms, but unconscious bias is essentially how our brains work. That is, we create things called schema, which is essentially patterns of data. And then when we get new data, we attach it to the patterns we already have. The issue with unconscious bias, so if you've read like Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, that's kind of same premise, is that unconscious bias then leaves out a whole cohorts of people. And that then is not only is it not fair from an economic perspective, it's actually not good for anyone. Yeah. We're actually constricting everyone's economic opportunity through not essentially moving toward equity for all.
What made you want to do this?
That could be a whole podcast in itself.
Bring it. This is the podcast. Who are you? What makes you tick?
So there's three reasons three really kind of key pieces that made this a decision to move toward this. One is my family history. Two is how I grew up. And the third is my own experience in the workplace. So my family history, I'm the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee. My mom was born in 1939, the year that World War II began, on the Isle of Guernsey, which is a Channel Isle of England, closer to France than the United Kingdom. And when France fell to the German army, Prime Minister Churchill, who, if you've seen Dunkirk or The Darkest Hour, that's what was happening right before this, doubted his ability to defend the Channel Isles, and so he evacuated them. And the first ship off of Guernsey was 5,000 children. My mom was on that ship. She was 18 months old, separated from her mother, her four siblings, placed into an orphanage, and adopted a year later.
Oh my God.
And then she came to America when she was 21 for equality and opportunity. So that's my mom's story. My dad's story is, so he and my three eldest sisters are refugees. They escaped after the fall of the 1956 revolution in Hungary. They crossed a minefield, crossed the border, actually where the Iron Curtain later went up, and arrived in a refugee camp in Austria. They lived there for just under 2 months when President Eisenhower sent Air Force One to bring 21 Hungarian refugees to the United States on Christmas Day, 1956. And they were part of the 21 Hungarian refugees.
And then your parents met each other?
In Chicago. In the heartland, in the Midwest,
oh my God.
in the rest of America.
The generational trauma. Oh my God.
Well, but the lesson that I took, particularly from my mom, particularly from my father's story, though, my mom's story, there's a lot of gender inequity in her story. But from my father's story was this, that I am here today in America. I have this opportunity to start a company and talk to you and all these things because one person in a position of power stood up and said, not on my watch. This will not happen. And that, I think about that and I think about my dad and I think about him. I mean, he's deceased now, but I think about him a lot because for me, one of the things I think about is he made the difficult decision to escape, not only risking his life, but the lives of his three daughters. My sisters were 3, 7, and 8 at the time. And he decided it was better to risk their lives in pursuit of freedom than to commit their futures to essentially living under communist rule, which he had suffered from. He'd been in a couple of camps. And I think about the hope of a parent going from making that decision to watching your daughters climb the stairs of Air Force One to freedom. And that is what as hard it is as it is to start a startup. I'll talk about some of my own experiences. That decision and the ability to impact someone's lives that one person can have has been and continues to be a huge propelling force in my life of what impact might I have? What might I do? Particularly given the fact that I was very fortunate to be born in this country, in the United States with all of the issues we have, but I was fortunate to be born here, there was an obligation to do something with that opportunity.
Because anything's possible.
And so I am actually the youngest of 6 kids. So and 5 girls, 1 boy. And there are a lot of laws that were in place in my lifetime that actually inhibited my sisters and their families' economic opportunity and therefore well-being. So things like you couldn't get a business loan as a female business owner without a male cosigner. You could be fired for being pregnant. You could not get housing without a male cosigner. So all these things
You could get a credit card.
You can get a credit card.
Yeah, this stuff is not that old. It wasn't that long ago.
Yeah. Middle school when you couldn't get a credit card, and what I remember as a little girl, because my sister. So it's my 4 sisters, my brother, and then myself. And I remember looking up and thinking, my oldest sister was the valedictorian of her high school class. My sister who's closest to my brother, my 4th sister, she graduated summa cum laude. These are smart women, and just watching the struggles that they had simply because of their gender and the impact it had on their children. That was the other thing. I was very, because we have a really big family and we're all not that far apart in age. And I just remember that and just thinking, I never want to do that. I remember very clearly at 5 years old thinking, I am never going to do that. I don't know. I just am never going to. I'm just going to figure that out. And I think that was a catalyzing force for me.
Well, because it's so stupid. When you watch it and you're like, what? That makes no sense.
And it is. And it has a huge impact on the children and their economic opportunity and their ability to believe in themselves, believe that they have value, believe that they belong, believe that they can contribute. It doesn't, oftentimes when we talk about women or women's issues or gender equity, we think it's only about women, and it's not. It's simply not. When you look at the math, it's not about women. It's not only about women. And that's what I saw when I was a little girl.
It's about the whole family.
It is.
And what you can dream for yourself.
And can you go to private school? Can you afford to do soccer camp? Can you afford to be tutored? Can you afford, just all these opportunities, I think sometimes that maybe we're not aware of the impact that they have.
Right. So you come from a family of slouches. That's what I'm understanding.
Yeah, we're all pretty competitive. It's like never get us in a room with a game of Risk because you'll probably won't leave for a few days. We all want to take over the world.
Exactly. So then you went and got a bunch of degrees.
I did.
Tell us which.
I have a bachelor's degree in political science with an emphasis in legal studies. I spent a year at the University of Oxford studying political philosophy and political theology. I have a master's degree in educational technology, which is essentially computer science and cognitive science. So understanding. So this was really before the days where you could be a back-end developer or a front-end developer or UI UX developer. You were everything. So I learned 4 programming languages. I learned data science. I learned UI UX design. All of those pieces.
How many women were in your program doing that?
That's a good question. I don't know.
You say back in the day and studying computer science, and I'm thinking, oh, you're the only one there.
I was not the only one there, but I don't know if it was evenly split. I'd have to go back and look at how many men versus women. And then I have an MBA, which was more men than women. It was an executive MBA. So I think there were 20% women and 80% men.
Okay. Then what happened when you went out and started working in the world?
So I, as a poli-sci major, legal studies emphasis, I was an intern on Capitol Hill in college. And so learned a lot about women's issues, and then got to the workplace and thought, I just don't think this really applies anymore. I don't see it. And so kind of,
right?
You're like, it's equitable now.
It's fine.
Yeah. And this was a while ago because I've been in the workplace for 25 years. And so, thought, okay, And so kind of set off on building my career and getting my degrees. And then I was on maternity leave with my daughter. And my boss was optimized, which is a fancy word for fired. And when I was on maternity leave, and I had a team I was managing, I came back, and the next day I was asked to take on a second team. And I was like, this is a great opportunity. I'm a breadwinner for a family of 4 now. My husband has been home, I think at this point for almost 3 years. And then 2 weeks later, I was asked to take on a third team. And I was like, well, this is great. So really excited about this opportunity. How do you want to make me whole in my compensation? Like, how do you want to shore this up? And I had a male colleague who was 1 pay grade higher than I was and received additional compensation for that new team. And I received nothing. So I went back to HR, my new boss, and I said, this is great. What do you want to do about it? And it was kind of 2 months of back and forth talking. Nothing happened. I was a litigation paralegal right out of college. And I thought there has got to be something that makes this illegal. I just can't imagine that this is okay. So I went and did a bunch of research, and I found the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, and which essentially changed the statute of limitations for equal pay. So essentially what it did was move the time from when the decision was made about pay to every time you pay someone. So I called HR and said, hey, this is a Lilly Ledbetter issue. Every time you pay me, the statute of limitations starts over. What do you want to do about it? And then I just used silence as I just was quiet,
So did that get their attention?
It did. So they increased my level, increased my pay, and gave me back pay. And when I tell, certainly it's a story of success. It's a story of standing up for yourself. But also I thought about, well, why did I have to do that? Why did I have to spend my time researching my rights in order to be treated fairly when the law clearly says that I should already be treated fairly?
Right. Why do you have to low-key threaten?
So one of the things I thought about the first time I fought to be paid equitably, which hit me, which I've talked about subsequently, is that as the breadwinner for my family, and women are the breadwinners in 40% of U.S. households, and 71% of all U.S. households with children rely on women's earnings for their economic well-being.
I'm raising my hand.
We talked about what essentially the retaliation or the pushback I received after I stuck up for myself. And I was afraid of that. What I was afraid of was essentially when I spoke up, would I be putting my family's economic well-being at risk? And so what was the decision? What was the essentially cost benefit of speaking up? And that was one of the things I set out to solve with Pipeline, because we proactively give recommendations. If I had been working for a company that had Pipeline, instead of me having to go to HR and say, this is illegal, essentially, my boss would have come to me and said, actually, you've got a pay gap. We're going to close that. So not only would that make me a lot more loyal to that company, I wouldn't be put in the position where I had to choose between being paid fairly and the economic well-being of my family, which essentially is how a lot of our laws, like the Equal Pay Act was signed in 1963 by President Kennedy. That's how those laws are set up, which still relies on me, or anyone, me in this instance, but to speak up. That's also something that we need to think about changing going forward, that the responsibility shouldn't be on me as an individual. It should actually be on the system to change.
Right, because then you have to complain about it. And then we know women are penalized for that more than men are. They're respected when they go in and ask for a raise, and the woman's a pain in the ass.
Yes, and mostly white men. But I think there is a racial issue there in terms
You're right.
Anyone who is an out group. So if you are a woman, you're a woman of color, if you are a Black man, if you're a Latino, if you're LGBTQ, anything that's essentially an out group will suffer those consequences. It just happens to be that women are the largest out group, and anytime you intersect race and ethnicity or age with gender, those women tend to be farther behind.
And then did you get any backlash from having stood up for yourself like that?
I did. So I had been promoted a number of times in the years that I was with the company. I won't say what the name of the company was. And then the very next performance review that I received, I'd always gotten stellar ratings. Like I was never just succeeds. I was like exceeds, outstanding, et cetera. The very next performance review, I experienced what the EEOC calls retaliation, which is that I got needs improvement on communication. I was a litigation paralegal, so I was like, where's the documentation for that? But anyway, but yes, I did. And I didn't quite understand what that was until later.
Yeah, that is comedy. I'm hearing you communicate. I think you're just fine. Okay, so then what happened between that and you deciding to do this startup?
So that experience kind of woke me up to what inequity looks like now in the workplace. And because I had inherited two teams, I had also inherited all of the inequity that were on those two teams. So I made a commitment that if you worked for me, I was going to do everything I could to make sure that you received equity of pay and equity of opportunity. So that was really my first commitment. And then I fought to be paid equitably a second time, not at that company. It was within a negotiation for a salary, a new job. And I just started to notice these patterns. I started to notice how women were being essentially sort of siloed or migrated into certain roles. I wanted to be a CEO. I knew that. It's why I got an MBA. And I remember talking to a gentleman who was my mentor / sponsor. And I said, well, look, I want to be a CEO. This is where I am. Here's my plan. And he meant well, but he said to me, well, Katica, you're already the CEO of your family, as if, what more do you want? You're too ambitious, and he meant well, but I was like, oh my gosh, this is like, and then I also saw a lot of because I'm a breadwinner. Yeah. Okay.
My mouth is hanging open, which is why I'm silent. You're already the CEO of your family?
That's what he said to me. But you're already the CEO of your family. And I just, at that point, I really knew how to use pregnant pauses. I just was quiet. I was like, I'm going to let that set in.
Okay. Go ahead. Carry on.
And so what I started to see was this, I had done... what I started to see were a few things. One is that, we know that education attainment is, from a labor economics, like putting on my economics hat, from labor economics perspective, education attainment is the foundation for essentially almost all equity in the workplace, regardless of if we're moving away from college degrees, whatever. That's it. And then you have labor force participation, so women actually participating in labor force, and then wages themselves. And I thought, well, look, I did my part, which is I worked hard, I got my degrees, and now I just want the same opportunity as a guy who's my age. And what I started to also see was that a lot of the solutions that we focus on in the workplace are about fixing women. They're not about fixing the system that undervalues women. So those could be examples like we talk about flexibility in the workplace. Well, women need more flexibility. I didn't need more flexibility. I needed more opportunity. I had a stay-at-home parent, a full-time stay-at-home parent. So there was sort of an assumption of what I needed. When I was pregnant with my son, I was asked if I was going to stay home. That was not even an opportunity. That was not an option for me. I was the breadwinner of my family then, and our health insurance was through my company. I couldn't quit. So I saw that. I saw this, well, women don't apply for jobs as often. And I knew the other side of the story, which is that when we tell women that we say women don't apply for jobs unless they have all 10, 100% of the criteria, men 60%. Well, I knew the data, which said that on the other side, the person sitting across the table from you was using that very same criteria, right? So there was that. I'd also experienced that myself by applying for jobs. And I was like, I can do this. And the way women speak, women's leadership programs, we need to train them how to be in the workforce. We need to mentor them, which is, I think mentorship is well-intended, but fraught with issues. You're sort of assuming that people don't know rather than sponsoring them and just assuming they can do it and putting them forward. So I started to see that a lot of the issues, a lot of the solutions that were being put into place were maybe made people feel better, but weren't actually going to solve the problem. The other issue,
and they're based on the assumption that women aren't ready or qualified or capable unless they're given all this extra help, whereas men are qualified and capable and trusted because they showed up.
Right. And that we essentially are damsels in distress that we're the charity case.
Right.
So I saw that. The other issue I saw, and most of my experience is either in sales, working in sales operations, reporting to a head of sales, or working for really senior levels in organizations. And so I knew that in order to really move a company forward, you had to not look at something as the right thing to do. That's important. But companies exist to make money. If they don't make money, they won't be in business very long. And so how could you change the narrative from gender equity as a social issue to one as an economic opportunity? The other thing that does is it neutralizes the issue. It's no longer men versus women, us versus them. It's, they win, I lose. The zero-sum game goes away when you look at it from an economic perspective. And now fundamentally it's about economic opportunity for everyone. And women no longer are the charity case and men are no longer the problem. So now the problem's on the other side of the table. You are all on the same side of the table, pushing it forward in pursuit of equity for all.
So now you can talk about it.
Yeah.
Without anybody being the bad guy.
That's right. Which also serves to move the conversation forward. When we point fingers, it doesn't mean you shouldn't point out things, but when we make someone the bad person or we sort of us versus them, it makes us feel better in the moment, but it doesn't in the long term actually solve the issue. For me, that also was deeply personal because that kind of thinking is what led my mother to be an orphan and my father to be a refugee. They had personally dire circumstances because of that kind of thinking. And so I understood that at a very deep level because they are my parents. And when we set out with Pipeline's brand and narrative, and we can talk more about that, I was very clear that that's not what we were going to do. We were not going to point fingers at people. It doesn't mean that we weren't going to be truth tellers. That's different. But we weren't going to say this person's bad. We were going to try and work to have everyone together and pull people to a higher calling.
Right. Instead of, what your problem is?
Yeah.
Well, you're sexist and you're racist. So let's start there.
And they're like, okay, I got to go now. Yeah. Exactly.
Look at the time.
Yeah.
You know what I want to ask you, which is the origins of this podcast, I want to say 4 years ago, we were talking a lot about this, and then the conversation has shifted over the years. But part of your success has got to be the fact that your husband is home with your kids. ?
I would not. So the issue is that women tend to just not own their success. Like they tend not to say, I did this, like not in a, just they need to own it. So I think that part of the success of my family is that my husband and I are a team and he has his role and I have mine.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. So I because I've been people have said, oh, you're so lucky that your husband stays home. And he's lucky to be married to me. I just right. I mean,
it's his good fortune.
That's right. Like we're a team. We're a team. And it is good for my family, for me to be successful and for my children to have a person that they know is there.
Yes. And I'm curious about how did you two negotiate that in a world of different gender role expectations? Or were you just in agreement from jump and this is how we're going to do our family?
No, we both worked the first year of my son's life. He's 13 now. And it was horrible. It was like, everybody was on a treadmill. Oh,
it's hard.
It was exhausting, and then you've got that plus the layer of change. Anyway. And what happened was, this was actually during the 2008 crisis. So the financial Great Recession, he lost his job and I was promoted, and it just made financial sense for him to stay home. And that was how we navigated it. We did talk about it because 12 years ago, there's a lot more talk now, which is good, about dads staying home, dads wanting to stay home, how we support dads staying home. When he stayed home, we really talked about it because, for instance, he wasn't going to go to the mom and me groups. He's like, that's weird. I mean, that's just be weird.
For me.
Yeah, not for me. And when he would take like our son to Gymboree or to music class, he was not only the only dad in the room, he was the only man in the room among a group of stay-at-home moms and female nannies. And so, we talked a lot about that because that isolation and how he would navigate that change. It was more about that communication than it was about, anyway, kind of a negotiation, if you will.
Yeah. Because how did he deal with that? Because that's a whole other factor of maybe what his expectations were, or how he's navigating in that world where I imagine those moms weren't like, yeah, come hang out with us all day.
Yeah. And he was like, he wouldn't have wanted to anyway, but because for him, it was about something bigger than himself. It was not about who am I and who am I going to be, though he definitely has, like any human being would go through that question. What it was about was our family and about our children and about us as a unit. And how do you make that work? So because it wasn't so much about him, it was about something bigger. It just changed the conversation.
Okay. Tell me more about Pipeline.
So we launched the first gender equity app in the Salesforce AppExchange. Last year, we were named one of Time Magazine's 2019 Best Inventions.
Well done.
Thank you. And in March of this year, we were named one of Fast Company's most innovative companies.
An idea whose time has come.
Yes, that's right. And actually, interestingly, given the dynamics of COVID-19 and then Black Lives Matter, which are connected, that has actually spurred the conversation forward toward action, which is what Pipeline has spent over 3 years preparing for.
With everybody, the time is now. Like, if you're not going to address this stuff now, what are you doing?
Right. So those are some of our key wins that we've had.
Tell me this. How can people reach you or find out more?
Well, you can reach me on Twitter, Katica Roy, KATICAROY. My messages are open. So don't troll me. But you can also reach me at pipelineequity.com. And there's a get in touch box that you can, those are probably the easiest ways to reach me.
And people should sign up for your newsletter.
Yes. So if you go to pipelineequity2es.com, on the bottom of every page is the ability to actually sign up for the Brave Souls newsletter, which I send out every Thursday. And I write quite a lot. A big part of Pipeline in our history is that we actually started first. So we did the research, we set about building a platform, but at the same time, we were very interested in changing the narrative around gender equity. So we launched a campaign called Fix the Leaky Pipeline, which was sort of our entree into changing the narrative, which eventually became Equity for All. And we actually garnered 18 million impressions as a new brand in 2 months with that campaign.
What?
So, and it was this idea of gender equity not as a social issue, but as an economic opportunity. And that gender equity is not a synonym for women's rights. It's actually, women are 50% of the conversation, men are the other 50%. And so it's actually about equity for all. And, pre-COVID, now I speak a lot virtually, but pre-COVID, I spoke a lot of about 50 speaking engagements a year. And often after I speak, men will come up to me and thank me because I talk about gender equity as a men's issue. Mm-hmm. I think that's an important topic that we don't talk about enough. We talked a little bit about my husband. I have a son and a daughter. But, men, 48% of working dads would like to stay home with their kids, but they don't because of identity and isolation. This idea of who am I going to be if I change, and who am I going to talk to? Who am I going to connect with? That's something we talk about a lot. We talk about mental health as a men's issue as well, because we know from the data that that's something we must start to address. Because it is negatively impacting men predominantly. I mentioned I write a lot. So I write for Fast Company and World Economic Forum, NBC, Bloomberg, a number of outlets. And one of the things that we actually launched earlier this year, because it is a presidential election year and a big voting year, was a voting guide. So last year, I interviewed 4 of the Democratic presidential candidates. So Vice President Joe Biden, Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Cory Booker, and Mayor Pete Buttigieg about this idea of gender mainstreaming policy. I think this is a particularly important topic. And this idea of when we think about women's issues in policy, we think about reproductive rights mostly, and maybe equal pay, if we're lucky. And what we knew from our research was that really the gender pay gap cuts straight through the US economy. And you could gender mainstream or gender lens most campaign issues. So I sat down with each of those folks. I asked them about their commitment to gender equity and what would that look like? Really interesting responses. Vice President Biden actually talked about his commitment to gender lens every single policy that he puts forward. And
good.
Yes. And from that, I wrote a voting guide, which essentially is looking at 15 campaign issues from mental health to student loans, criminal justice, et cetera, Social Security, and looking at through a gender lens. And people can actually get that if they go to Katica Roy, one word, KATICAROY.com/voting guide. They can actually download that voting guide. And that was really to help people educate their vote and understand that with almost every issue that you're voting for in an election, it is a gender equity issue, and it is also an economic issue.
Okay, I'm getting that.
And it's free.
Good.
All you need
and it's free.
All you need is a name and an email address, and that's all we ask for. And I think, that our message has had a lot of traction. I mentioned what we got in the beginning. Last year, my writing alone had over 1 billion impressions. And it's just, people are hungry for a message that is new, that is different, that is validated through data, that looks at the future, that talks about where we are, but also talks about what we can do and how, as a collective, it matters more than sort of us as individuals, if you will.
Well, I think you're doing incredibly important work and doing so much of it. I don't know how you have enough hours of the day.
I love it.
It's your mission. It's your passion.
And I was given the opportunity to have this life. And, because I was born here, because of what President Eisenhower did for our family, I have this opportunity and I intend to make the most of it.
You're not going to waste it. We can all take a lesson. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to The Other 50%, a herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Walker. I'd like to thank Katica Roy for sharing her story. And special thanks to Jay Rowe, Danny Rosner, and Allison McQuaid for the music. Please find us on your favorite podcast provider and leave a review. And of course, on our website, theother50%.com, all spelled out, for added features, bios of our guests, and the merch. You can also follow us on all the social media platforms. Next week is episode 200, and I'm celebrating with my guest, Saraswathi Balgam. Don't miss it. Thanks for listening. See you next time.